Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out in the snow and the weather. Thank you, Joan, for doing your hard work and going deeper than you'd ever probably dared and bringing us treasure. Thank you. The value for this month is well-being. We promote wholeness and wellness of mind, body, and spirit, recognizing our self-responsibility, our interrelatedness, and interdependence. And in our culture, well-being often is defined in a more individualistic and materialistic way. And it's marketed as a commodity, something that we can purchase or accumulate. So the way this community has defined well-being and wholeness is so important, recognizing that it's both an individual responsibility, but also inseparable from our collective well-being, that wholeness is about interrelatedness and interdependence with our human and natural world. And at this time of year, the natural world is teaching us that inner work and introspection is important for well-being. It's a time when growth on the outer world slows and energy is drawn in and sinks down under the surface of the earth. It's a time of restoration and darkness. And we're headed towards the winter solstice on December 21st, that marks the longest night and the shortest day of the year. And our ancestors, through time, marked this journey into darkness with ritual and stone circles, lighting candles, watching stars, in expectant waiting, assuring us that light will come again to break our horizon and to give new life. And that ancient understanding of Earth cycles is echoed in many religious traditions of this season that celebrate the gifts of light and life and peace and ground us in well-being and wholeness. And this is what we need to practice now, because our outer world is moving to increasing instability. We experience turmoil. In the last 2 weeks, President-elect Trump's appointments of billionaires and generals, phone calls and tweetage, have raised concerns around the world about our collective well-being and about the earth. And as we move into the realization that this is actually happening, people share that they're experiencing vertigo, despair, depression, anger, fear. So how do we turn this towards well-being and wholeness? That was the question I was sitting with the last 2 weeks. So I wanted to talk about bearing hope and giving light. The readings this morning remind us that hope is not optimism or the state of our world. It's an orientation of the mind, body, and spirit towards wholeness, no matter the circumstances we find ourselves in, that it is a way of life. It is the magnificence of compassion, courage, kindness that we carry and we bear within us, helping to steer things in a good direction, helping to light the way. In Latin America, the word to give light and to give birth are the same word, to dar luz. To dar luz is to give light and to give birth. So there's an understanding that to give light, to illumine a situation, to light the way, is a creative process. It's not just flipping a switch. It requires inner work, descent, risk. It means being led deeper than we would ever dare go, to bear the dream, the creative energy, the liberating action that can come through us and break our horizon. Mystics through the centuries, and also peace and justice leaders, have spoken about the ground of hope as a place of luminous darkness. Philosopher and writer Charles Eisenstein says that right now, as a society, we are in a space between stories, with an old story that's falling apart, that's come unhinged, and is unmasked. He writes, "The cultural story of my youth was a world in which there was nothing wrong with soda pop, in which the Super Bowl was important and the world's greatest democracy was bringing democracy to the world. And from my location, this story seemed unquestionable. Looking back, I realize that I was in a bubble world, built also on human suffering and environmental degradation. But the story was robust, and it kept information to the contrary on the margins." And he talks about when old stories fall apart, there is instability and turmoil, but there is also the opportunity to see, to be illumined, to cooperate with the unfolding of a new story that is informed by and inclusive of the margins of all that has been excluded. It is a time of luminous darkness. So reflecting on all of this, a story kept presenting itself to me. And it's a story from Nicaragua many years ago. It was my first live encounter with liberation theology. It was at a time of instability and turmoil, and also a time of empowerment, hope, and light, and a time when people were creating a new story. And I was a little hesitant to share it because it does involve a reflection on the Christmas story. And I'm mindful of the baggage that this tradition carries. Also, I'm mindful of the wisdom and the grit that's contained in this story that is fed by so many traditions. This story that is a carrier of ancient and timeless and universal symbols about bearing hope and giving light, and it kept showing up, so I decided I would share it. So this was my first year in Nicaragua. It was 1984, and it was just before Christmas. And there was a little village called San Juan de Limay, and it was under siege at the time. And Witness for Peace, the organization we were working with, thought it would be important to have a larger international presence there. So there was a Maryknoll nun named Sister Nancy Donovan, and she lived there, and she invited us to stay at her house. So we did. We moved in, and her home was a beehive of community action. And one night, the young people from the Christian-based community in the village were gathering at their home. It was sort of the equivalent of a youth group. And Sister Nancy was printing out their programs that they had put together. And so she asked me to help her. So she had one of these old mimeograph machines that you ink up, and you have these stencils that you lay on, and it's a big mess. And this is in a dusty, dirty place with no electricity. So it was quite a challenge to keep all these things not getting full of dirt. So I was helping her, and she's cranking and running off the copies, and off comes this sheet, and I'm picking them up so that they dry. And the Christmas readings are on the back, and on the front is an image of a peasant woman, bare feet, firmly planted on the ground, and she's birthing a child whose head is just crowning, and one arm is raised high in a power salute. And this was their Christmas reflection. And I thought, wow, this is going to be a Bible study like one I've never experienced before. And it was. The place was packed full of young people, and they read the Christmas readings about the journey to Bethlehem, no room in the inn, the shepherds, the wise men, the star, all the things I was familiar with. But their reflection on this story, from their place on the margins at this time of revolution and counter-revolution, and how it spoke to them about their reality, was new to me. And it was a gift, and it gave me hope, and it stayed with me all these years. So first, they took this story and they did their contextual analysis, because they were in liberation theology. And for them, this was a story about a young woman who was poor from a backwater town, a single mother in a time of patriarchy, at a time of empire, militarization, tyranny, oppression, taxation, forced migration, and political persecution. It was a time of instability and turmoil, very much like their own reality. And what spoke to them in this story was that despite the hard-heartedness the risk, the turmoil going on all around her in the outer world, this young woman did not despair. She sang her Magnificat, her powerful song of her bold and wild dream. She was part of a movement. She was writing a new story about dismantling hierarchies and power structures that are not life-giving, and about the creation of a new paradigm that was rooted in and swelling with equality, inclusion, well-being, and wholeness. And she was a carrier of this new story, a protagonist with agency. She was focused, grounded, creative, and empowered. And this spoke to them in that story. The second thing that spoke to them was that the peasants and the people from the margins knew where to go to find hope and light. They got there with no problem. They were familiar with luminous darkness. But the wise men in the story had a little more trouble. They had gone straight to the king, thinking he could show them the way, and that this had put everything at risk. And so they had to be shaken by a night dream that told them that they must go home in a very different way, that they could not go home the same way they had come. And they were reflecting on this. This really stood out for them. And for them, it meant that some part of these wise men were still operating out of the old story, still looking to the old power structures for direction or hope. And that this was an important caution in the story, that in times of instability and turmoil, there may be a tendency to look back and look to the old story because it's known, because it's familiar, but that we can't go home that way. We must go deeper than we would ever dare to go, to unexpected places, to the margins, into the muck and the mess of the world. That is where hope and light and new stories come from. And that was their reflection that Christmas. Quaker educator and writer Parker Palmer says, "The way to well-being is down and embodied. It comes from a spirituality that engages fully with life's mess on the ground." So as this year comes to a close, I wanted to take a moment to look to the margins, to the mess on the ground, to the ordinary people in unexpected places that are bearing hope and giving light in the midst of our turmoil and instability, and are breaking our horizon with a new story. Yesterday was International Human Rights Day, December 10th, and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights made a pretty uncharacteristically strong statement. He says, 2016 has been a disastrous year for human rights across the globe. Growing erosion and unprecedented pressure on the international system of human rights and rule of law risks unraveling protections set in place at the end of World War II. He says, in the United States and parts of Europe, anti-foreigner rhetoric full of unbridled vitriol and hatred is proliferating to a frightening degree and is increasingly unchallenged. The rhetoric of fascism is no longer confined to a secret underworld of fascists. It is becoming part of normal daily discourse. That's the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights yesterday. And he announced the launch of a new UN campaign called Stand Up for Someone's Rights Today. And he said, it is the responsibility and it is within the power of every individual to push back against these pressures, to keep the human rights framework on our collective horizon so that it can continue to bear hope and give light to the most vulnerable, to human rights defenders around the world. Last week, the United Nations awarded its highest environmental honor, the 2016 Champion of the Earth Award, to guess who? Berta Cáceres. For her visionary leadership, inspiration, advocacy, and action for the earth and for life and dignity for all. The UN spokesperson said, Berta Cáceres refused to allow powerful interests to violate the rights of the poor and the marginalized or to destroy ecosystems on which they depend. Her focus was local, but her calls and her sacrifice resound throughout the entire world. Her award was received by her brother, who wore a lenka cloth around his neck and a handmade cardboard sign with cut-out letters pasted onto it that said, "Berta has not died. She is multiplied. Justice for the Gualcarque River." This award bears hope, and it lends the entire weight of the UN system to Berta's impossible dream and to water protectors everywhere. And we watch in amazement as she continues to give light from the place she is planted in the earth near the river she loved, in a place called La Esperanza, Honduras, which literally means the depths of hope. This week also, we saw thousands of US veterans journey to Standing Rock to support water protectors there, who have been grounded in a spirituality of peaceful resistance and prayer on the front lines of an 8-month-long direct action to stop a pipeline that resulted also this week in a decision by the US government to deny an easement required for the pipeline to continue as planned. It's an enormous victory going into winter, and people celebrated. And they also signaled that they know the struggle is not over, that energy companies have vowed to continue, that President-elect Trump may reverse the ruling, that he has already announced a proposal to privatize Native American reservations to accelerate the extraction of oil, gas, and other minerals. And they tell us that in recent days, water protectors have experienced a wave of threats and harassment by white North Dakota residents. It's important to be aware of all of this, to be very wise, and still celebrate what the water protectors on the cold, dark plains of North Dakota have done, and how they have borne hope and given us light that resounds around the world. And also from Standing Rock, last week, a forgiveness ceremony took place at the Four Prairie Nights Casino and Resort, another unexpected place. When veterans spoke words of apology to tribal representatives and asked for forgiveness for crimes by the US military against Native peoples and lands. And in response, Chief Leonard Crowdog called for world peace and reminded everyone, we do not own the land owns us. And these words of apology, this forgiveness ceremony, also bears hope and bears light. And as many people in the country grow fearful about the possibility of deportations in the coming year, the new sanctuary movement is being organized in cities and churches, on college campuses, and among networks of people across the country. Many are the same communities that operated an underground railroad in the 1980s, sheltering refugees who were fleeing death squads in Central America at the time. This new sanctuary movement is preparing to take action, to stand up for someone else's rights, affirming our interrelatedness and our interdependence. The Human Rights Campaign is a civil rights organization working to achieve LGBTQ equality and society at home, at work, and in every community. And they report that in Chevy Chase, Maryland, many residents displayed rainbow flags on their porches and lawns and homes when Vice President-elect Mike Pence moved into the neighborhood. And this was their way to send a message of equality, inclusion, and welcome in response to his anti-LGBTQ record. And why only Chevy Chase in this season when we celebrate peace and light is a good time to display rainbow flags on porches and lawns and car bumpers everywhere, at home, at work, in our communities. And here in West Michigan, there is an organization called Michigan Citizens for Water Conservation. Many of you probably already know about it. In 2001, they learned that Nestle Corporation was taking water from the commons from the Great Lake Basin to bottle and sell for private profit at virtually no cost and with significant tax breaks. So this little organization took Nestle to court, a process that lasted 8 years and cost $1 million in legal fees, which they say they paid for, and this is a quote from the treasurer, "Scrambling for every penny we could get. We did 50-50 raffles among us or anybody else we could get involved. We did yard sales, we wrote grants, we had bake sales, we sold pasties. We raised $1 million with no corporate and no government money." And today, these water protectors are opposing the new attempt by Nestle to expand its water withdrawal from 150 to 400 gallons per minute. So with only 4 days' notice, this group mobilized the submission of thousands of comments to the Department of Environmental Quality and got an extension on the comment period, and they're now pushing to extend that period until 2017 and to require public hearings on Nestle's expansion. They need thousands more to take action. We can go to their website and every one of us can stand up to protect water. And right here in this community, I've heard that Patty Baldus is organizing a bus to Lansing on January 21st for those who want to participate in the Million Woman March on Washington in its local expression. And this march and Patty's efforts bear light and give hope because women's rights are human rights and they are at risk, and we're not going back to the old story. We will be focused and grounded and empowered, and we will go together into this deep and luminous darkness, bearing hope and giving light. Rumi has a poem called Night Travelers. He says, "Search the darkness, sit with your friends, don't go back to sleep. Life's water flows from darkness. Search the darkness, do not run from it. Night travelers are full of light. And you are too. Do not leave this companionship." So at this time of instability and turmoil, I wanted to invite us all to take a moment to affirm this companionship, our interrelatedness and our interdependence, and the many ways we empower, bear hope, and give light to each other as we write a new story. And as we learn to mature and live and love in a way that enables us to succeed as great turners and be ancestors in the eyes of the future. So I want to invite everyone to just take a moment to reach out to each other and pass the peace of this well-being and this wholeness this morning.